Well, this 20th chapter of 2 Samuel, that is often called Sheva's rebellion or revolt, is going to shape this evening's lesson. Now, we got just a little ways into it last time as we found the northern 10-tribe coalition that this chapter usually refers to as Israel, having a contentious argument with the 2-tribe southern coalition that is usually called Judah. Now, this fiery meeting took place at Gilgal, the place where David was re-coronated as king of Israel. Now, Sheva is a Benjamite, and he's regarded in this episode as a scoundrel, an Ish Belial, and the one who attempted to foment a civil war. But the issue of this attempted civil war is briefly interrupted in verse 3 with a mention of the 10 concubines that David left behind at his palace when he fled Jerusalem a few months earlier. And here we find that these violated members of David's harem would be, through no fault of their own, regarded by David as damaged goods. So now they're unworthy of his continued relationship with them. So they were set aside. They were reasonably cared for, but they were treated like living widows. Now we run into a very similar scenario in the book of Esther. So the bottom line to this is they would never know a man again. And these 10 women will die childless. So open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 20. We're going to start at verse 4. And if you have a complete Jewish Bible, that's page 357. We're just going to read through verse 13. Starting at verse 4. The king said to Amasa, "Summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days, and you be here too." Amasa went to summon the men of Judah, but took longer than the time he'd been given. And David said to Abishai, "Sheva, the son of Bichri, is going to do us more harm than Absalom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him so that he won't take over fortified cities and escape us." With him went Joab's men, the Keriti, the Peliti, all the experienced soldiers. They left Jerusalem in pursuit of Sheva, the son of Bichri. Now, on arrival at the big rock in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them, and Joab was wearing his battle clothes, over which he had girded a belt with a sheathed sword. But as he came forward, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, "Is it going well with you, my brother?" Then with his right hand, Joab took Amasa by the beard to kiss him. Amasa took no notice of the sword in Joab's hand, so Joab stabbed him in the groin. His insides poured out on the ground, and he died without having to be stabbed a second time. Joab and Abishai, his brother, continued in pursuit of Sheva, the son of Bichri, and one of Joab's men standing by Joab said, "Whoever is on Joab's side, whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the middle of the road. So as the troops came up, they all halted there. And when the man saw that all the people were standing still, he dragged Amasa off the road into the field and threw a cloak over him. Once he had been removed from the road, all the troops went on after Joab to pursue Sheva, the son of Bichri. Now, David had promised he would elevate Amasa, who was the general in charge of Absalom's ill-fated rebel military. And he would do this to be his own general of the Israeli army, and in doing so now replace Joab. He had participated in the killing of David's son, the rebel leader, Absalom. And having done that, verse 4 has the king telling Amasa to to form up the men of Judah into an army and then to bring them to Jerusalem. The purpose was as a force to counter the tribal army from the north that Sheva was attempting to gather. But Amasa was given only 3 days to accomplish his task of gathering up the men of Judah. And one has to just wonder why David would demand such a large undertaking to be accomplished in such a short time, because by all accounts it was unreasonable. It was unrealistic to think that Amasa could ride around to all the various cities and all the villages throughout the substantial territory of Judah and Simeon and muster and equip and ready an army in 72 hours. Likely David was simply being impetuous, or he's being impatient, and we have no record of Amasa objecting to the impossible assignment, as Joab certainly would have done. So it was inevitable that, as verse 5 says, Amasa missed his appointment. Thus, when Amasa didn't show up with these men in 3 days, David immediately turned to Abishai, who was Joab's brother and another one of his longtime field commanders, and he told him that it was urgent that he go after Sheva because he would cause more damage than Absalom had done. David was so anxious to short-circuit Sheva's anti-government actions that he instructed Abishai to take only the much smaller forces that David calls his servants. In other words, these men, who are usually identified, at least in Hebrew, as the Peliti and the Kariti, were more or less David's private army. These were men who were especially loyal to him, who were essentially a small standing army of professional soldiers, not at all like the militia of tribesmen that Amasa was instructed to go and try to round up. Apparently, Joab also had a group of professional soldiers that he had separately maintained, and so Abishai took them as well to pursue this Sheva. Well, verse 8 explains that a few days later at Gibeon, which was an important city in the tribal territory of Benjamin, Amasa finally shows up with some number of militia troops accompanying him. And probably to his great surprise, there stood Joab, the deposed former commander of David's army. So get the picture here. While David had dismissed Joab as his general of the army, Joab didn't leave the army, nor did apparently he give up his authority over the army. In fact, the troops under his direct command stayed loyal to Joab, probably figuring that if the past was any indication, this situation was going to be short-lived anyway. So now we see that the reason that David had Amasa scurrying about the countryside of Judah looking to reform this militia is because it is obvious to David and to Amasa that the professional fighting men of Israel, they had no interest in serving under Amasa. Instead, they were staying loyal to Joab, to his brother Abishai, and if Amasa was going to have any army at all, it would have to consist of whatever farmers and herdsmen and tradesmen that he could round up on pretty short notice. So Joab put on a happy face for Amasa, and he behaved as though all was well. And to further put Amasa at ease, Joab approaches him, and he says, "Oh, is everything well with you, my brother?" And this affectionate greeting would have rung true to Amasa, as indeed Amasa and Joab, well, they were first cousins. Very close family, by the way. Very close for that era. And further, to disarm Amasa, we're told that Joab reached out and grabbed Amasa's beard, and he kissed him. And the grabbing of the beard was a sure sign of kind of a playful friendliness. And no doubt the slightly worried Amasa suddenly felt a lot more at ease with this warm greeting and this manly Middle Eastern traditional kiss on the cheek or the neck that accompanied it, but it was actually all a murderous deception that harkens back to earlier times when Joab then too refused to allow any of his rivals to live. So the narrator tells us that Joab was in full battle dress. He was wearing his sword when he greeted Amasa. So while at first glance that should have made Amasa wary, Joab's warm and brotherly demeanor calmed his fears. Joab reached out with his right hand. No doubt Joab was right-handed. And he used that to playfully grab Amasa's beard, and as he did so, his sword silently slipped out of its scabbard and fell to the ground. And using his free left hand, Joab picked up that sword and jammed it into the lower abdomen of the startled Amasa, essentially disemboweling him. The blow was so swift and on target that Joab didn't need to withdraw his sword and thrust it into his cousin a second time. But there was another reason that Joab didn't stab him again. He wanted Amasa to live just a little longer. A soldier usually finished off his enemy opponent. It's sort of a kindness so that the pain and the agony didn't linger. But Joab, he wanted Amasa to suffer as an example for anyone daring to think he could take Joab's position as second in command of all Israel away from him. So now things were back to normal. We're back to square one. Joab and his brother Abishai were once again in command of David's forces, and they resumed their pursuit of Sheva. Now, one of Joab's men yelled out to the militiamen that Amasa had brought with him, and that whoever was on Joab's side, well, they were really on King David's side. So, regardless of what happened, they should now follow Joab, just as they had intended to follow Amasa. In other words, what happened to Amasa is irrelevant to this military operation. They were never going to fight for Amasa anyway, but rather for their king, King David. So now Joab, who has always been David's general, says the militia should just continue on as before and just consider it as serving their king no matter who's leading them. But now, within a little while, Amasa was a gruesome sight. I mean, his death pangs left him writhing in his own blood and innards in the middle of the road, and as this militia of farmers and herdsmen approached, the sight so horrified them that they instinctively just stopped and stared, transfixed, unable to turn their gaze away, so fear began to overtake them. Not so much because they were concerned for Amasa, but because they could suddenly picture themselves in that same condition as a result of fighting Sheva and his men. One of Joab's men, who was obviously an experienced professional soldier, instantly understood what was happening. So he dragged this dying corpse well off the road and covered over his body with a cloak so as to avoid a mass panic. Well, the troops now headed towards the far north of the land, among the several fortresses that were built near Lake Merom. And finally, they tracked down Sheva to Abel, or rather to Abel Beth Maachah. Sheva and apparently a mere handful of men took shelter inside of this walled city, no doubt threatening the local residents. Well, Abel is a Hebrew word for brook or a stream. So this city was called the House of Maachah by the brook. That's what it means. The place is best identified today as being about 12 miles north of the Hula Lake, just a little east of Tel Dan, way up in the north of Israel. Now we're told that Sheva had traveled through the northern tribal territories, those whom he purported to represent, gathering up men for his army of rebellion. Now, it would appear that while he gathered some, it was mostly men from his own family, his own clan. And we're told that Barim joined him. Later, these men are identified, or rather is referred to as Berites or Bichrites. Now recall in verse 1 that Sheva is identified as the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. So Berim, Berite, Bichrites, these are all just variant spellings of Sheva's clan's name. A clan that was likely currently the largest, probably the most influential of the several clans that formed the tribe of Benjamin. So this fortified city with high defensive walls had to be attacked siege style to get at these men. So we're told Joab's troops began to build an earthen ramp up against the city wall. Now, our complete Jewish Bible and a few other Bible versions will speak of a moat surrounding the city. The word moat is simply not there in the original. It was added in medieval times, as it was usual to have a moat, just kind of a canal filled with water, dug around the walls of a fortress. If anything, the city of Abel Beth Maachah may have had a trench around the bottom of the walls to effectively make scaling the walls more difficult, but to characterize it as a moat, that's a pretty big stretch. Well, anyway, once the ramp was built, Joab's troops began bashing the top part of the wall to try to gain entry. Let's read a little bit more. We'll start at verse 14 of Samuel chapter 20. Page 357 again, starting at verse 14. Sheva went through all the tribes of Israel to Abel and to Beit Maachah and to all the Berim. They assembled and they followed him. Joab's troops came and put him under siege in Abel of Beit Maachah. They put up a ramp in the moat against the city wall, and all the people with Joab battered the wall in order to bring it down. Then a wise woman in the city shouted, "Listen, listen, please tell Joab, come over here so I can speak with you." He approached her, and the woman asked, "Are you Joab?" And he answered, "I am." And she said to him, "Listen to what your servant has to say." He answered, "I'm listening." And then she said, "In the days of old, they used to say, they will ask advice at Evel." And that would end the discussion. "We are among those in Israel who are peaceful and faithful. Why are you destroying a city and a mother in Israel? Why swallow up the inheritance of Adonai?" And Joab answered, "Heaven forbid. Heaven forbid that I should swallow or destroy anything. That's not how it is. Rather, a man from the hills of Ephraim, Sheva, the son of Bichri, has raised his hand against the king, against David. Just turn him over to me. I'll leave the city." And the woman said to Joab, "All right, his head will be thrown over you to the wall, over the wall to you." And then the woman went to all the people with her wise plan. They cut off the head of Sheva, the son of Bichri, and they threw it out to Joab. So he sounded the shofar. They left the city, sending each man to his tent. And while Joab returned to the king in Jerusalem, once again, Joab was commander over the whole army of Israel, while Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Keriti and the Peliti. Adoram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, the son of Achilud, was secretary of state. Sheva was recorder. Zadok and Eviatar were Kohanim, the priests. And Irah the Yairi was David's priest. Well, as the residents of Abel began to realize that they were likely going to die right along with Sheva and his men, they decided to take action to prevent it. As we're told that suddenly a wise woman appeared on the ramparts, and she called down for a parley with Joab. Now, this wise woman is in Hebrew called a Hakom Isha. Hakom Isha. and there is no consensus on what her actual or official role may have been. She probably was not a prophetess, which was an official role and a title, but rather just a woman who was well known for her wise, if not godly, counsel. So she was held in very high esteem by the citizenry of this city. In any case, she calls down to the troops below. She asks for Joab, the commander. Joab responds in a respectful way to this woman, strongly hinting that he knew of her and that he had unusual respect for this woman because once he identifies himself, she demands to know, are you listening to me? The word used here for listening is shema, from the root word shema. And the, of course, meaning is to hear and then to act on what you hear. So this isn't an issue of Joab merely being asked if he could discern this woman's voice from atop the wall, but rather it is if Joab is ready to seriously consider and then do what she's about to advise. Well, verse 18 says that the woman begins her counsel to Joab by telling him that since time immemorial it has been proverbial that the people would journey to this city of Abel Beth Makkah to seek wise counsel on difficult matters. And the counsel given was considered as so certain to be correct that once it was given, all debate ended. So the idea is that there was an ancient custom that some of the citizens of this city were of a family or maybe even a cult that was considered as almost infallible sources of wisdom and advice. So this wise woman's message to Joab is, don't disregard what I'm telling you, you're going to be sorry. And Joab didn't seem to reject that notion. Well, the Hakom Isha, the wise woman, proceeds to tell Joab that this is known as a peaceful city, one that's always been loyal to the king, so to attack it is just wrong. She adds more drama by saying, why swallow up the inheritance of Yehovah? A mother city means a principal city. The ancient system of urban planning was you'd have a principal city, a mother city, usually a walled fortress, and then there would be several nearby villages that depended on that city and were also usually under the authority of that city's king. Together they formed a community. They formed a local economy. Either formally or informally, they also cooperated for the local defense, so that an attack on one was an attack on all. And in case of an attack from a powerful enemy, then all the local villagers, they would flee to the mother city where there were walls for their protection. Well, when the wise woman said that Joab was in process of destroying the inheritance of Yehovah, she was using Torah terms. And it was referring to the Hebrew people who lived there because the Israelite people in the Israelite land are called by God many times his inheritance. That's why the Lord protects his people and his land with such fervor, and why it is the utmost folly, it's an offense towards God to stand against his people and or his land. And I don't care if it's in ancient times or modern times. Doesn't matter. They are his inheritance, meaning they are his holy property. And you want to know something? You don't mess with God's holy property. At least not without severe consequences, even if they don't happen immediately. Therefore, Joab reacts to her accusation, couched in a question, with, oh, heaven forbid. Even the warrior general Joab, who has just ruthlessly murdered his cousin Amasa for nothing more than his own personal ambition, he understands the seriousness of misappropriating or destroying that which belongs to the Lord. So basically, the wise woman is saying to Joab, why didn't you just come here and inquire of us first before you started a siege? Not to inquire, by the way, is a direct violation of Torah law. And that itself brings a punishment by God. Listen to Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 12. When you advance on a town to attack it, first offer it terms for peace. If it accepts the terms for peace and it opens its gates to you, then all the people there are to be put to forced labor and to work for you. But if they refuse to make peace with you, they prefer to make war against you, then you're to put it under siege. So Joab says, very well then, if you just turn Sheva over to us, we'll leave. And the wise woman responded, all right, we'll throw his head over to you. Negotiations ended. That's what happened. The townspeople killed Sheva, and they gave his head as proof to Joab. Joab identified the head as Sheva's. He blew the shofar to signal the battle to cease. Everybody went home. This is why I said last week, it's probably a little bit too strong to term this episode as a rebellion. In the end, it really didn't amount to much more than one man's crusade against David, and he was dispatched in short order, not by a soldier, but by a group of townspeople led by a woman. In the final few verses of this chapter, we are given a listing of David's cabinet as constituted at the time of Sheva's revolt. Now, we got a similar list back in chapter 8. Of course, that was from an earlier time in David's reign. And while the list is substantially the same, it shouldn't surprise us. There are some additions and subtractions that have happened over the last few years. In a nutshell, David's inner circle looked like this. Joab was once again the top general of the army. He accomplished this by murdering his cousin Amasa. He did have some number of professional soldiers that formed a very small standing army, but when any kind of a serious threat developed, the army had to be conscripted from the Israelite civilians that form a militia, if you would. Now, Benaiah, he commanded a small group of soldiers that was mainly David's palace guard. Adoram, he was the administrator in charge of forced labor used for government projects. The labor force consisted usually of captured prisoners of war, almost entirely non-Hebrews, of course, but probably a few Israelites as well who had committed some offense against the state. Later on, it seems that King Solomon, by the way, routinely began to add Hebrew forced laborers to the pool for his ambitious building projects. Now, Jehoshaphat, he was the recorder. In Hebrew, his position is called a zakar, which means to remember. He could remember. That means he wrote it down so he could remember. And our complete Jewish Bible says he was Secretary of State, but that's, I think, way off the beam. Okay. I find no indication that his job was Israel's chief diplomat. Rather, he was more or less the royal historian. He oversaw treaties and rulings and probably recorded the feats of the king for posterity. Now, Sheva, he was the sofer, which is often translated, by the way, as scribe. He probably just created certain legal documents. Zadok and Eviatar, they were the high priests, meaning that still at this time, King David maintained, no doubt for political expediency, 2 high priests. Solomon was going to remedy this decidedly wrong situation by removing Eviatar, who was not of the legitimate line of high priests descending from Aaron. Finally, there is Erah, who was David's priest. Now, early in David's reign, he used a son of his as kind of like a family priest. Now it was somebody else. And the fact that Erah is called a Yaririte probably means he was from the area of Gilead. No matter, there's little doubt that this person was not a Levite. So whatever priestly duties he was doing was wrong. Now, it was customary for a king in the Middle East to employ a family priest, just as it was for wealthy and aristocratic families to do the same thing. However, for a king of Israel to do this, well, that's a terrible thing. In fact, the rabbis tend to say that the reason that this infamous fact of a family priest is mentioned here is because it is directly related to the famine that comes next in the Holy Scriptures. That is, the rabbis say that David having this illegitimate family priest had at least as much to do with the famine happening as did the stated cause of Saul's family unjustly killing certain people from the town of Gibeah. In both cases, this was considered divine retribution for wrongdoing by a king of Israel. And as we end this chapter, it's important to take notice just how corrupted with Canaanite pagan ways that David's administration had become, especially as concerned the priesthood. Not only did he have two high priests, he employed a family priest as well, which meant that David was involved in some kind of unrecorded sacrificial rituals that were completely unauthorized by God's Torah. Let's move on to 2 Samuel chapter 21. Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 21, page 358, if you have a complete Jewish Bible. In David's time, there was a famine. It lasted 3 years, and David consulted Adonai. And Adonai said, "It is because of Saul and his blood-stained house, because he put to death the people of Gibeon." The king summoned the Gibeonites and said to them, "These Gibeonites were not part of the people of Israel, but from the remnant of the Amorites. And the people of Israel had sworn to them. But Saul, in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah, had sought to exterminate them. David said to the Gibeonim, the Gibeonites, 'What should I do for you? With what should I make atonement so that you will be able to bless Adonai's heritage?' The Gibeonites said to him, 'Our dispute with Saul can't be resolved with silver or gold, and we don't have the right to put anyone in Israel to death.' He said, 'So what do you say I should do for you?' And they answered the king, 'The man who has ruined us, who schemed against us so that we would cease to exist anywhere in Israel's territory, have 7 of his male descendants handed over to us, and we'll put them to death by hanging before Adonai and Gibeah of Shaul, whom Adonai chose.' The king said, 'I will hand them over.' But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before Adonai between David and Jonathan and the son of Saul. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Ayah, whom she bore to Shaul, Armoni, and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai the Mechlati, and handed them over to the Gibeonites, who hanged them on the hill before Adonai. All 7 died. They were put to death during the first days of the harvest season, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Rizpah, the daughter of Ayah, took sackcloth and spread it out toward a cliff for herself, and stayed there from the beginning of the harvest until water was poured out on the bodies from the sky, not letting the birds land on them during the day or the wild animals at night. David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Ayah, the concubine of Saul, had done. So David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Yavesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the open square of Beit-Shan, where the Philistines had hanged them at the time the Philistines had killed Saul at Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son. They also gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the territory of Benjamin in Selah, in the tomb of Kish, his father. They did everything the king ordered. Only after that was God prevailed on to show mercy to the land. Once again, the Philistines made war on Israel. David went down with his servants and fought against the Philistines, but David began to get tired. Ishbenoth, one of the sons of the giant, said that he'd kill David. His spear weighed 7 pounds and he was wearing new armor. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue by striking the Philistine and killing him. Then David's men swore to him, "You must no longer go out with us to battle, in order not to quench the lamp of Israel." A while after this, there was again a war with the Philistines at Gob. Sibkai, the Hushati, killed Soph, one of the sons of the giant. There was more war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elchanan, the son of Yari or Gim, the Bet-Lachmi, killed Goliath the Gitti, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam. There was again war at Gath, where there was a belligerent man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He too was the son of a giant. When he mocked Israel, Jonathan the son of Shema, David's brother, killed him. These 4 were sons of the giant in Gath. They all fell at the hands of David and his servants. Now, this chapter begins a section of what some scholars call an appendix to the book of 2 Samuel. It seems to be a collection of miscellaneous information about David and his administration that didn't fit very neatly chronologically anyplace else. So the first thing to understand is that these various happenings aren't in chronological order, and that they are at the end of the book, and it has nothing to do with when they occurred. Now, a second important context for studying this chapter is this. Especially when we read the part about David's solution for the famine, we need to recognize that what we'll see is a mixture of Torah law, Middle Eastern customs, and pagan superstitions. It is not recognizing this tragic reality that has caused many a preacher or a Bible teacher to fumble around in this chapter, trying to find some loophole or technicality to explain David's actions that many presume to be God's direct instructions to him. Thus, many Christian scholars spend a lot of time apologizing for God for what went on here and explaining that as a result of the coming of Messiah, God's changed. And now, never in our time would he ever take this kind of a course of action. The first important miscellaneous piece of data that comes from this appendix, this section of 2 Samuel, is that at some point, David dealt with a famine that lasted for 3 consecutive years. And this famine undoubtedly occurred fairly early in King David's reign. Now, we need to understand that to experience a famine means there was insufficient food for the local population. It does not mean there was no food. It means there wasn't enough to go around, and that malnutrition was going to be the result, particularly for the poorest. And in the worst cases, starvation for some. But nearly inevitably, especially in the area of Canaan, this lack of food had to do with a drought. The only other typical reason other than a drought for a famine would be pestilence. And when that happens, it's almost always just for a single season, not even for a full year, just one crop rotation. So we can safely assume that there was a severe lack of rain, and the crops and the orchards and the vineyards failed to produce very well as a result. Further, other parts of this episode support the conclusion it was 3 straight years of too little rain. Now, a year of not enough rain, this wasn't unusual in Canaan. Even 2 straight years of less than average rainfall wasn't rare. But after 3 years, David decided this was sufficiently beyond normal that he would approach Jehovah and inquire if this was merely a normal, although challenging, climate cycle, climate change, or if this was a divinely caused calamity. This consultation with the Lord would have been through his high priests, not any kind of direct communication between David and God. And the means of communication would either have been lots, or it would have been those Urim and Tumim stones. David did not have direct communication with God the way that Moses did. And Jehovah responds that indeed there is a divine cause for this absence of rain. And the cause is that it's because of what Saul and his household did when they put to death the people of Gibeon. So from God's perspective, what's the issue? Blood guilt. Blood guilt. Holiness is the overriding principle of the Bible. And it's the underlying characteristic of God. And Numbers chapter 35 tells us that since the land of Canaan was divinely set apart for God's people, and it was the exclusive property of God, then the holiness of the land was of paramount concern because God dwelled with his people there. If the land became too defiled, God wouldn't be able to remain among his people. But one of the worst possible defilements of the promised land, or any land really, is that caused by innocent human blood being shed upon it. So according to the Torah, the murderer's sin cannot be atoned for by a sacrifice of an innocent animal. Rather, only the murderer's own guilty life, just that, could satisfy the requirement and so cleanse the polluted land of blood guilt. Now, this story of Saul and of his family unjustifiably killing certain residents of Gibeon is not to be found in our Bibles. In fact, the only mention in any record of this massacre is right here. What's important to know is that these particular residents of Gibeon who were killed were not Hebrews. They were Amorites. These particular Amorites had made a peace treaty with Israel that went all the way back to the days of Joshua. But what complicated the matter was that they had made that treaty through deceit. Let's go back and read about what happened. Open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 9. Joshua chapter 9. And we're going to read verses 1 through 18. Joshua chapter 9, starting at verse 1. 250 if you have a complete Jewish Bible, page 250. When all the kings on the west side of the Jordan in the hills, in the Shephelah, and all along the shore of the great sea that fronts the Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard what had happened, they joined forces to fight together against Yahushua, that's Joshua, and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeah heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they developed a clever deception. They made themselves look as if they'd been on a long journey by putting on old sacks on their donkeys and taking used wineskins that had burst and been mended back together. And they put on old patched sandals on their feet, and they dressed in worn out clothes and took as provisions nothing but some dried up bread that was crumbling to pieces. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "Oh, we've come from a country far away. Now make a covenant with us." And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "How do we know that you don't live here among us? If you do, we don't want to make a covenant with you." But they answered Joshua, "Oh, we're your servants." And Joshua asked, "Well, who are you? Where did you come from?" And they answered him, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the reputation of Adonai your God. We've heard reports about him, everything he did in Egypt, and everything he did to the two kings of the Amorites across the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, at Ashtaroth. So our leaders and all the people living in our country said to us, take provisions with you for the journey and go and meet them and say to them, we're your servants. Now make a covenant with us. Well, here is the bread which we took for our provisions. Look, it was still warm when we took it out of our homes the day we left to come to you. Now look, it's all dry and turned to crumbs. And these wineskins, well, they were new when we filled them. Now look, they're torn. Likewise, look at these clothes of ours. Our shoes are worn out because of a very long journey. Well, the men sampled some of their food, but they didn't seek the advice of Adonai. So Joshua made peace with them, and he made a covenant with them to spare their lives. And the leading officials of the community swore to them. But 3 days later, after they had made the covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors, that they lived there with them. The people of Israel traveled and arrived at their cities on the third day. Their cities were Gibeon, Kephrah, Beerot, and Kiryat Yearim. The people of Israel did not attack them because the leading officials of the community had sworn to them by Adonai, the God of Israel. But all the community grumbled against the leaders. Now, what makes this so complex is that not only did the Amorites completely misrepresent who they were, but verse 4 explains that when the Amorites asked for such a treaty, Joshua and his elders didn't even bother to consult with God about it. In other words, they didn't go to the high priest and by means of either lots or the Urim and Thummim inquire from God what they ought to do. The end result is that in their own minds, making this treaty made good sense. So what could possibly be the harm? But then they discovered they'd been duped. So does it matter that the people who pled for the treaty came deceitfully? Or are the Israelites stuck with it, no matter the circumstances? Well, Joshua then 18 through 21 says this. The people of Israel didn't attack them because the leading officials of the community had sworn to them by Adonai, the God of Israel, but all the community grumbled against the leaders. However, the leaders replied to the whole community, look, we've sworn to them by Adonai, the God of Israel. We can't touch them. Here's what we'll do to them. We'll let them live so that God's anger will not be on us because of the oath we swore to them. Yes, let them live, the leaders continue, but let them chop wood and draw water for the whole community. The bottom line is that since Joshua and the elders had not bothered to consult God, but did vow an oath of peace in God's name, there's no going back on it. This would be what we might call a rash vow, but it's still an official vow nonetheless. And barring the Amorites disavowing this peace oath or attacking Israel or something like that, this peace treaty and the accompanying vow was permanent. It was irrevocable. However, as a punishment for the deceit, Joshua made the Amorites wood choppers and water drawers. In other words, they became forced laborers. As it turned out,